human beings have a lot in common with other creatures. And when we first look at a photograph of a lizard or a chicken or a moose, we don't see much of a resemblance between those creatures and human beings. But actually, if you look at them, there are some real similarities, right? Just look at the basic body plan, the placement of the head, the eyes, the nostrils, the mouth, the limbs. And the chicken is walking on 2 limbs, and then it's got its other 2 limbs as wings. The moose is walking on 4 limbs. The lizard's walking on 4 limbs, but there are 4 limbs, just like human beings. And the basic body plan is the same, and biologically, human beings and other creatures are the same in terms of sort of the natural stuff that they are made of. Human beings, lizards, chickens, moose, made of pretty much the same stuff. Although, as we read in the creation story, in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, this Hebrew creation story in the Old Testament, human beings are unique in that they're made not just of the stuff of the world. Human beings are made of dust, but they're also made of the breath of God. And so this story indicates that human beings are unique. We are creatures that have a lot in common with other creatures, but we're also quite distinct. And one of the things that makes people distinct is that human beings ask questions about their own existence. Now, I guess we can't say with absolute certainty that lizards don't think deep thoughts, that chickens don't think deep thoughts, but there's no evidence I'm aware of that chickens have deep thoughts. But certainly human beings do. And human beings ask questions like, why was I born? And we asked that question in an earlier discussion. When we were talking about Socrates, remember, that we can answer the question, what is a car for? We can answer the question, what is a screwdriver for? We can answer the question, what is a house for? But what am I for? Why do I exist? What is the purpose of my life? We ask other questions. Why is there suffering? This question shows up in the most ancient literature we have, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the book of Job, a Hebrew text, an ancient Hebrew text, the book of Job. Why is there suffering? And then people can ask, what is the best way to alleviate suffering? And one other element of the human condition is that then people disagree. So people can look at suffering and they can agree that the suffering needs to be alleviated, but then they can disagree on how to alleviate it. And then they can ask the question, why is it so hard for us to get along? And then we can agree that we want to get along. But then when we ask the question, what is the best way to promote cooperation, then maybe we'll disagree about that. And human life is very complicated. And Aristotle makes, what is an obvious observation, that living together is hard. And often living in our own minds is hard. The state of our own souls can be troubled. All of this is related to the human condition, this sense that human beings have that on the one hand we can make lives for ourselves and be pretty comfortable in this world, but on the other hand there's often this sense of being ill at ease. We're not completely at ease in our skin in this world, and this is the human condition. This is the stuff of what we call the human condition. Now, Plato seemed to think that it was unlikely but possible for human beings to break out of this situation. And they could do it if true philosophers, that is, if true lovers of wisdom, were in charge of human communities. Plato famously said there will be no end to the troubles of states or of humanity itself until philosophers become kings, or until kings become philosophers. If we can get to a place where true lovers of wisdom, philosophers, can be kings, true lovers of wisdom, philosophers, can manage our state. If we can get to that place, then the troubles of our states, the troubles of humanity will, to a substantial degree, go away. Plato seemed to think it's possible to break free of the human condition. Plato wrote that the true philosopher's mind has a broadness of vision, contemplates all time and existence. Right? And since I'm not apparently qualified to be a true philosopher, I don't really understand that sentence. Like, Plato, what does it mean that this person contemplates all time and existence? I mean, I kind of understand, but not really. And I think Plato responds, well, that means you're not destined to be a true philosopher. Okay. Plato says that where most people see only beautiful things, the true philosopher sees beauty itself, and we can think of beauty with a capital B. Where most people see good deeds in the world, it's the philosopher who is able to see goodness itself, and we can think of goodness with a capital G. And Plato gives us a simile. What he's talking about is kind of like the sun, and here's how it goes. Suppose that people can see things as the result of the light of the sun. Thanks to the light of the sun, they can see trees. Thanks to the light of the sun, they can read. But they can't see the sun itself. The true philosopher is the person who can see the trees, who can read thanks to the light of the sun, but also sees the sun itself. The true philosopher is the person who sees good deeds and also sees goodness itself, who sees beauty, but also who sees beautiful things, but also sees beauty itself. Philosophers are those who are capable of apprehending that which is permanent and unvarying. The philosopher's mind is kind of, it's kind of in some celestial place. It has this universal view, right? The rest of us are in the shadowlands. The rest of us are just kind of getting through life, looking at what's around us, touching what's nearby. But the philosopher's mind is sort of, kind of has a celestial, sort of a universal view, right? So I kind of understand what Plato says, kind of don't. I guess that means I'm not destined to be a true philosopher. A true philosopher, according to Plato, loves reality, which isn't this table, this room, this world that we can see and touch, right? Reality for Plato is goodness with a capital G, sort of out there. Beauty with a capital B, out there, right? Sort of that external world, that world that's free of the shadows, all right? Most of us are trapped in these shadowlands, but there's a world outside. And the true philosopher can see that true world. The genuine lover of knowledge aspires to reality. And what Plato's referring to is the reality outside this world, until the nature of each thing as it really is grasped by the mind of the philosopher. So the true philosopher, the true lover of wisdom, is sort of tapped in to that external world. And that's the real world. And this is the world of shadows. Plato acknowledges that a tiny number of people are capable of this kind of thinking, right? Only a tiny number of people can be true philosophers, right? And he thinks it's unlikely that the kind of community he describes in his Republic can come into being. He thinks it's unlikely, but he doesn't think it's impossible. He says the compulsion to build such a community is feasible, meaning it's doable. Not easy, but doable. We're not talking about theories that are unrealizable, that is, they cannot be realized. These are realizable theories. In other words, they can be put into practice, Plato says. Right? Very hard, but it can be done, right? And I think what we're looking at here is the temptation of thinking that someone can rise above the human condition. That seems to be what Plato's suggesting, that there is a tiny number of people who can rise above the human condition. All these questions that bother people. Why am I alive? What's human life about? Why is there suffering? All of these questions, there's a person who can break free of that, right? And who can lead the rest of us to some kind of clarity of vision, to the extent that we can have it because we live in the shadowlands, right? But the true philosopher, the philosopher king, can take us in the right direction, and that person is not troubled at all by these kinds of questions, because that person's vision is so comprehensive and so cosmic and so universal, right? The temptation of thinking someone can rise above the human condition. Now, I think St. Paul, reminding us of this passage we've looked at before, in this statement he makes in a letter to people living at a place called Corinth, he says, now we see through a glass darkly. In this world we see through a glass darkly. And so Paul and Plato agree that this world is a kind of shadow lands. They don't use the same language, but they agree that in this world, clarity of vision isn't really available, right? Now the difference is Plato says, well, there is a small number of people who can break free. Paul seems to suggest, no, in this world we're not going to break free. In this world we see through a glass darkly. In the next world, then we'll see with clarity. In this world we know in part. Then we shall have greater knowledge, that is, in the next world. Plato says that in this world a tiny number of people can break free. Now I'm reminded that there have been episodes in history where leaders have arisen and have claimed to have a special vision. They know how to get society to some great place. They have the clarity of vision. They see almost infallibly the road to greatness and glory and happiness and prosperity. If you look at that top image there, that's Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. Look at his body language. I know how to get to the great future. And the people around him looking at him with adoration. The next photo down, Mao Zedong in China. He knows how to get to the great and glorious future. And people are around him in the body language expressing adoration. Adolf Hitler, his clenched fist there with the sun shining down. He knows the road to glory. He knows the path to greatness, right? Next to him, that bottom photo comes to us from North Korea. Notice that in this case, the dictator of North Korea is almost pitched as a kind of sun, right? As the sun shining down, right? And in North Korea, they say that the dictator knows what the people are thinking. The dictator knows what thoughts the people have in their minds, so they should be very careful about what they think, and certainly very careful about what they say. Now, in each case, these societies that have been led by these leaders who presume to know the way, right? In every case, it's led to something awful. It's led to something terrible. Whenever a society has gone along with this idea that in one way or another, our leader has broken free of the shackles of the human condition and now sees with tremendous clarity the glorious future to come, and we just need to follow this leader, right? In every case, it's led to something truly awful. And so, although I do think that there's something useful in some of the basic points that Plato makes, and we'll discuss those as we go, I do think at the same time this temptation of thinking that someone can rise above the human condition, I think that this is wrong, and I think that it's potentially dangerous. I think it's potentially dangerous because we have historical examples of it where leaders claim not necessarily to be philosopher kings, but claim to have this unique clarity of vision. They know how to get to the great and glorious future, and we just need to follow them. In every case, it's led to terrible consequences, right? And then Paul, says, look, these are the shadowlands. We see through a glass darkly, and we want to see with absolute clarity, but that's not available to us in this world. We have to wait for the next one. I was thinking on this sort of topic of, the leader of great wisdom, right? My mind then went from Plato to Hebrew literature, to the story of Solomon in the ancient Hebrew book of 1 Kings, there in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. And we're told about this king named Solomon, who is the son of David, a great king in the history of Israel. And it says in the book of 1 Kings that God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore, right? In other words, this guy was really, really wise, right? Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt, right? And people come from all around to hear Solomon speak. So we'd think, wow, I mean, Israel has a leader this wise, everything's going to go great, right? I mean, that's Plato's theory, right? Now, I think, as the conversation went, we would have to kind of compare what the Greek conception of wisdom is and what the Hebrew conception of wisdom is. And I think the Hebrew conception of wisdom is a little more practical, right? But anyway, Plato talks about, the person of great wisdom leading the country into glory. Well, here we have a case of a person of tremendous wisdom, right? And let's see what happens. So as the story goes, God says to Solomon, "If you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever." Now, it's pretty obvious. Solomon is so wise. Of course he's going to do this, right? Of course he's a person of such great wisdom. Right. The Hebrew scriptures are pretty realistic, right? And sometimes they pack a punch. And what we find is that this person of great wisdom here, he does some good things, but he does some bad things too. For example, on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Now, this god is detestable not only because it's not the God of Israel, which, of course, in ancient Hebrew is not supposed to do anything in honor of any god but the God of Israel, but Molech is a particularly awful god because it's a god that requires child sacrifice. Like, what? What's going on? This man of great wisdom is now setting up a high place, sort of a shrine or a temple, something like that, for a god that requires child sacrifice? What? He did the same for all of his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon, right? Although God had forbidden Solomon to follow after other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary. All right, so now we've got trouble. Now this can be a fairly discouraging story, right? Because we're told that this guy is a guy of tremendous wisdom. This guy is wiser than everybody. People are coming around from all around, to listen to this guy because he's so wise. And then, things fall apart, right? He gets into trouble. He gets his kingdom into trouble. People around him, he gets into trouble. Even this man of great wisdom, right? And this story can be a little bit discouraging when we look at it that way. But what it reminds us of is that in this world, the human condition persists, even among people of wisdom. That people who have arrived at a certain state of wisdom, a certain place of wisdom, they've got to be careful because the human condition persists, and we see through a glass darkly, right? We never arrive at a place of perfection. We always have to pay attention to what's going on. So when Socrates says that if we can get philosophers and people of great wisdom, lovers of wisdom, if we could only get one of them to govern us, well, that story in 1 Kings kind of responds and says, no, I don't think so. Now we remember that what Plato, his thinking about wisdom and the ancient Hebrews thinking about wisdom, I think we're not talking about exactly the same thing, right? But in both cases, though, Plato's saying, a person of great insight, of great wisdom, everything will be fine. Well, we have this person of great insight, of great wisdom, and everything's not fine because that person still makes a mistake. In other words, not even Solomon was able to break free of the human condition. And so when Plato says, look, the troubles of human life will end when philosophers are kings, I respond and say no. I'll go with the first part of what Plato says. There will be no end to the troubles of states or of humanity itself. Because that's just kind of the way it is. We see through a glass darkly. That's just the way it is in this world, right? We're not going to be able to break free of the human condition. Now, what we shouldn't do then is then just kind of say, so what's the point of trying? All right? And the reason for that is because while it's true that human beings cannot create perfect societies, it's also true that human beings can create pretty good societies. In the graph there at the top of the screen, we have nations listed according to the level of corruption that exists in the country, right? And this comes just from an organization called Transparency International, and I know it's not possible to read, the countries as they're ranked, but you can look it up and easily find your country, right? And by corruption we mean, is the court system trustworthy? Is the government trustworthy? Are the police trustworthy? Is the military trustworthy? Does the rule of law apply? Remember, Pericles says one of the great things about Athens is that, everyone is equal under the law. Is that really true? In corrupt societies, it's not. But some countries are pretty good. The country in the photo on the left there, orderly, peaceful, prosperous. The country on the right, total disaster. Human beings can do both. And so, although that story from Solomon, or that story about Solomon might be a little discouraging, it does serve as a warning, but it doesn't say, and this is how it had to be. Solomon had a choice, and so do we. What kind of world do we want to live in? What sort of society do we want to live in? What kind of community do we want to live in? What kind of lives do we want to have, right? Because the different societies around the world, the different communities around the world reflect the actions of the people who live in them. So it's very important. Can we look for a philosopher king to rescue us from the human condition? I don't think so. But can we build pretty good societies? Yes, human beings have done so. And so I'm reminded of what Aristotle says, that people can create their characters, right, through practice. And if we want to be just, decent, honorable people, then we need to practice doing those kinds of things. If we want to be brave people, if we want to be people of courage, then when the opportunity comes to show a little bravery, to show a little courage, then that's what we want to do. And Aristotle says that it is a matter of no little importance what sort of habits we form from the earliest stage. Some people might say, oh, these kinds of conversations, you shouldn't have these kinds of conversations until college, right? You shouldn't have these kinds of conversations until, a person is an adult. Well, Aristotle's idea is no, from the earliest age, let's start having these kind of conversations. What kind of people do we want to be? What kind of communities do we want to build, right? What kind of communities do we want to help build as a result of the kind of people we are, right? These questions are so important. Aristotle says thinking about the kinds of habits we're creating, right? This is one of the most important questions we can ask. It is a matter of no little importance what sort of habits we form from the earliest age. It makes a vast difference, or rather all the difference in the world. We can't look to a philosopher king to save us. We can't even look to people who at this moment seem extremely wise to save us, because they may mess up. But that doesn't mean that we have to, right? We can't be perfect. But we can pay attention to what we're doing. We can ask ourselves, what kind of person do I want to be, right? What kind of world do I want to help build? What kind of community do I want to help build? And we can get to work on that. And that is one of the most important things a person can do.